you're probably just going to avoid the polls. When people mistrust the government, if you have an apathy for politics, if you don't care about politics or politicians or elections, you're probably not going to vote. People who are satisfied with the status quo, for some reason, they don't go vote. They don't realize that, well, if you like the status quo, you probably need to go defend it by voting for a representative who's going to keep that status quo. People who have a lack of political efficacy, basically those are the people that say, my vote doesn't count. There's so many people that vote. Well, when you say that and when there's a lot of people that say that, it leads to low voter turnout. The mobility of the electorate, with so many people moving around and it's so easy to move around, it makes it difficult for people to get involved, particularly if you don't feel like you identify with a community. If you're new to a community, you're probably not going to go vote for representation in that community. In some states, and especially in past decades, the registration process was pretty Byzantine, which led to low voter turnout. One thing we saw to help that registration process were motor voter laws, and those made registration easier in numerous states by combining the voter registration process with other forms. Like you could go to the DMV when you're renewing your driver's license and check the little box that says you want to register to vote, making it a lot easier. What people are voting in, and we see all sorts of different types of elections. We've got primaries, we've got presidential elections, and we'll get to those types of elections. Primaries, these are nominating elections. These are where voters are choosing who is actually going to run in the general election down here that we'll get to. There are types of primaries depending on what state you're in. There are closed primaries, open primaries, blanket primaries, and runoff primaries. Closed primaries, those are primaries where only registered party members may go and vote for the nominee. Open primaries, this is where voters may choose candidates of either party once you get into the voting booth. Very similar are blanket parties where voters can vote for candidates of either party. And usually in these nominating processes, we're not just looking at two candidates from two major political parties. Normally there are numerous nominees, and if none of them gets a clear majority, a lot of states will go to a runoff primary where the top two candidates will face off if there has been no majority. When it comes to elections, Election Day, Federal Election Day, is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And the two big election types we see congressional elections and presidential elections. With congressional elections, we see those happening every even-numbered year. Presidential elections are happening every fourth year. Because they happen every even-numbered year, they happen more often than the presidential ones. And those elections that don't happen, or that happen when there's no presidential election happening at the same time, we call those off-year elections or midterm elections. During presidential elections, we also have seen before a coattail effect. If a presidential candidate is particularly popular, they tend to help out their lesser-known party members. People will do a straight-ticket voting if they like the presidential candidate enough. Speaking about the presidential election, we have multiple phases. There are steps before you can get to the White House. The first phase is exploration. This is a presidential nominee or candidate, will establish an exploration committee. And what that committee does is they try to figure out if there is enough support out there for both financial and popular for the candidate. If there is, typically a candidate will make an announcement that they are running for president. In the past, they had a whole caucus system, which is it's no longer really used because there were all sorts of corruption problems with it. You only really see it in Iowa now. But in the past, that's when party officials met to endorse a candidate before a primary, so it really led to those endorsed candidates becoming the primary nominee. After that, they go through the actual primary process, which we already talked about, where the voters are going to determine what they're voting on. It's not voting for the person, they're actually voting for delegates, and those delegates are going to go to the nominating convention, the next step, and they are going to support the candidate at that convention that have been selected by the voters. And at the convention, we see those delegates choosing a nominee, both presidential and vice presidential. They're also going to write the platform, which is the party's stance on all sorts of issues. Pretty much every issue, they're going to write a stance on it. And it's also meant to unite the party. After the nominating convention, the real work begins. They go into campaigning and general election mode. When they campaign, we see several debates. Like this past election cycle, we saw 3 presidential debates, televised debates. Those have been a big staple since 1960. Typically, when they campaign, they go and hold rallies and political meetings in the swing states, the states that they're hoping to win, hoping to deny the other party, the other candidate from winning. And a big deal is to appear moderate. In the primary election, they typically have to take a much more a stronger stance with their own party. Like Democratic primaries, they tend to be very liberal and they go onto the left wing. The Republicans, they tend to be very conservative and go very strongly right wing. But during the actual general election, they have to appear much more moderate to try and win those independent votes. With the general election, a lot of people get very confused. It's not the popular vote that counts. It's the electoral vote, the electoral college. And what people are actually voting for when the popular vote happens, they're voting for voters. The voters, are voting for electors, and those electors are going to be the ones actually voting for president. In each state, the number that they get of electors that they get is equal to the number of senators and representatives. So you add those up, and you get their electoral vote. Washington D.C. gets 3 votes. Total, you add the whole system together, you have 538 total electors in the electoral college. Remember, this is a winner-take-all system. So if you get 51% of the popular vote in a state, you get all of its electors. It's not proportionally divided. The number you have to get to win is 270. You have to get 270 electoral votes to win. If no candidate gets a majority, I don't think it's ever happened. What it leads to, the House of Representatives is supposed to decide amongst the top 3 vote getters. So the Congress is going to decide who gets to be president. We have different types of elections. We have maintaining, deviating, critical, realigning, and de-aligning. Maintaining elections. These are where the traditional majority is going to maintain power in a presidential election. A deviating election is where some things have changed a little. The minority power actually gets to win. And the way they do is by they have taken in typically majority party voters and independent. And though this is not a permanent move, this is a temporary move. That's why they call it a deviation, because it's not going to become the normal. A critical election is when there have been drastic new changes in party loyalty, and usually this is due to changes in social and economic conditions in the country. Critical elections we saw were 1860, 1896, and 1932. A type of critical election are realigning elections. This is when the minority party is going to win with a brand new coalition. The famous example is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President FDR, won in 1932 by creating a brand new coalition, the New Deal coalition, because of the effects of the Depression. So this is a type of critical election. De-aligning elections happen when party loyalty is less important. People become less attached to their party. You see more independence and more split ticket voting. People are not just going to vote straight ticket, vote straight Democrat or straight Republican. They're going to pick the candidates they like from both parties. Also significant with this chapter, our last little subject is campaign finance. This has become a serious issue in past decades with so much money coming into elections. In recent decades, the history of campaign finance that you need to know. It starts with 1971 with the establishment of the Federal Election Campaign Act, which FECA. What that did, it restricted advertising money. It also forced candidates and parties to disclose the number of contributions and what they're spending their money on, their expenditures. It also limited self-finance campaigns, so billionaires can't run for office and just completely finance their own campaign. And then we also saw tax returns through donations, or you could use your tax returns, during tax season to make donations. Those are all now possible. We're going to see amendments to the original Federal Election Campaign Act after the Watergate scandal. That's going to lead to the creation of the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and that's in 1974, so only, 3 years after. It leads to the creation of public financing, so candidates can have access to public money. It denies foreign contributions. You cannot have China or France contributing money to your campaign. It limited individual contributions, and it also restricted the amount that political action committees, that PACs, could donate to campaigns. Later on we see this gets slightly affected, though, by the second court case you need to know for this chapter, Buckley v. Vallejo, where they found that spending limits and the rules against self-finance campaigns were both unconstitutional. People could spend as much money as they wanted on elections. Later on we saw changes in 1996 affecting the use of soft money. What soft money was originally intended for, it was meant for parties to use for things like voter registration drives, to spend on their convention, to set up issue ads, but they really started running into problems with it in 1996. The issues they had was that soft money was unlimited. These parties were raising vast amounts of soft money, and they weren't spending it on the things that it was meant for. They were spending it on candidates, which was a problem. So in 2002, we saw the creation of the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, the BCRA, also known as the McCain-Feingold Law. What that did, it banned soft money and also increased spending limits so people could spend more on campaigns. We also saw that it affected these other groups known as 527s. And what a 527 originally was an unregulated interest group. They tended to focus on a single issue or policy, but because they were unregulated, there was some corruption involved with them. So after 2004, after the McCain-Feingold Law, we see it regulated their soft money as well, and it also opened them up to examination by the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And the most recent laws affecting campaign finance was in 2010, when the Supreme Court decided that businesses, unions, and other groups, individuals, they may spend as much money as they want on campaigns. What it has led to in this election, and surely will in future elections unless the laws change, is that there's simply tons and tons of cash flowing in because there's no limits. So that's campaign finance, that's elections, and that's voting. So.